Well, good morning, everyone. And so today we're going to talk about the Gulf of Mexico. And yes, we're going to do a little bit of the oil spill and talk about some of the research that I've done in the Gulf of Mexico, one of my favorite places to hang out. If I'm not from Maine, if not in Maine, which is always where I prefer to hang out. But, you know, when you work down in South Florida, this is where you can get to sometimes. So the first thing we're going to actually go over is some of the geography. So can everybody see my screen, the shared screen there?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the Gulf geography is actually a really unique thing to deal with. 31 states of the United States actually drain into the Gulf of Mexico. And the biggest reason of this is the Mississippi River. Mississippi River is actually the largest drainage in the United States. It drains everything from the Rockies to the Appalachians, and everything in between all comes out and comes into the Gulf of Mexico. So how big is it? It's 932,000 square miles. So that's everything that we have here in the map. And that's a lot of miles. You know, you think that's a lot, but you think of the Atlantic Ocean or the Caribbean or anything else, it's actually really small. And if you notice, there is just one really small exit. So everything comes in, but everything that comes in is fresh water. But everything that is in there is salt water. So we have brackish, which is a little bit of salt and a little bit of fresh, that's up especially around the Mississippi River area. And but it is a saltwater area. So 38% of the actual geography of the Gulf is shallow and what we call intertidal areas. These are areas that are under 30 feet deep, and intertidal, which means they are in between the fresh and the salt water. That's sometimes brackish, sometimes not, but those are some of the big areas. And so that means there's a lot of wetlands that we deal with in this. And one of the reasons is if you've gone to the Gulf of Mexico, you realize it's very flat. So unlike if you're up, say, in New England or you're over in California where there's huge cliffs, we don't have that here. We're very shallow. So we have these huge marshes and these huge lakes that are out there. And that's really important to think about when we're dealing with the oil spill later as well. 22% of the Gulf is continental shelf. So if you're looking at this image, everything that is in the light blue, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the light blue here, that is continental shelf. So you can see that it's very, very shallow. Now, if you look over onto the east coast of Fort Lauderdale, in that area in Florida, you can see that the continental shelf just drops right off. And it really does, less than a half mile offshore. It just drops off into 500 feet. It's very, very shallow running for quite a bit of the Gulf. And that doesn't mean we don't have deep, because 20% is continental shelf, slope on it rather. So the slope is the darker blue, not quite the dark blue, but the darker blue. So that is the angle of which it is coming down. So you come in, you have the intertidal areas of the land base, then you have the continental shelf, and then it goes into the slope. And then after the slope, we go into what we call the abyssal or the deep areas. Those are the dark blues that you're seeing in the image. So that's 20% of it is this. So abyssal means, and you'll see another graph when I show you later, but more than 9,800 feet deep or deeper. And that's one of the things that was really interesting is before the oil spill, we knew it was deep, but we didn't know what was down there. And the reason we didn't know is we didn't have funding, because it's quite hard to go study the deep. We don't have the Titanic to go and say, come look at the Titanic and spend all the money. And by the way, could you do some science on the way? We don't have that ability here, unfortunately. But just to give you an idea of size of this, the volume of it is 6.43 times 10 to the 17th gallons of water. And if you're trying to figure out what that is, it's a quadrillion. So lots and lots of water on here. So that's the actual Gulf geography on this. But the interesting thing is how the water circulates in the Gulf. Another thing to take a thought of. So the water circulation in the Gulf is really interesting because not only do we have the water, the 31 states for the United States, but we also have 2 provinces in Mexico, and the Guava and the, I always get this wrong, Usamacata River also flow in from Mexico. And because of the fresh water and the salt water coming in and running into each other, they create these little spiral circular patterns which run off of each other. So that the range of the water circulation can be like this, can be very dizzying on that. And so they sort of sit, and you can see on the western side of the Gulf, they really don't go anywhere. And it's only until you get to the loop current. And the loop current is the water that actually comes up from the Caribbean and goes through and goes up almost to Louisiana. And then it goes, nope, and then goes through the Straits of Florida. And that is what we call the Gulf Stream when it comes over to the East Coast. So that's where the Gulf Stream actually starts. And it actually speeds up because of that pressure gradient between, in the Straits of Florida, between the Keys and Cuba. That's where it really speeds up. But that loop current is really, really important when we're looking at the oil spill later on too, because you can see where that Gulf current, that loop current is. That loop current, which becomes the Gulf Stream, is really important in Europe. And that's because the Gulf Stream actually is what warms Europe. If we didn't have the Gulf Stream running, the heat from the Gulf and the Caribbean would not be able to warm Europe. Because if you ever have a chance, take a look at a map and you'll see that Europe is at the same latitude as Newfoundland. And as you know, Newfoundland is not exactly a warm place. So that's what happens. And just a historical fact that there have been times that the Gulf Stream has not been running. And we're really kind of concerned about that, because if we get if we get a little temperature change instead of the great big one we have right now, that could actually slow the Gulf Stream and can cause cooling over in Europe. And that's what happened during William Shakespeare's time in the 1500s, which was called the Little Ice Age. And that was because the Gulf Stream was not running correctly into Europe. So there's a little fun trivial fact for you. So the loop current there is, again, the drainage of that. So 12.3 million square miles of watershed drains into the Gulf. And that's what causes all of those little changes. And that is why you have the freshwater and the saltwater meeting and causing this. In most of the time when we're dealing with currents, it's unusual. This is a very unusual event, because when we're usually dealing with currents, we're actually dealing with something also like the jet stream. We're dealing with the rotation of the Earth is what helps cause the currents. This happens to be because of water differentiation, which is really kind of a neat thing. And again, just to give you an idea, 280 trillion gallons of fresh water come into the Gulf every year. I think they might have a little more after Ida today, unfortunately, but that's the way it runs as well. So to give you an idea, that little dot up there, that little red dot, is where the Deep Horizon oil spill took place. So you can see it's actually just north of the loop current. And that was actually the saving grace for that oil spill, because if it had gotten into the loop current, it would have come over to the east coast of Florida, and then it could have gone over and actually impacted all of Europe as well, because the oil would have traveled with the loop current into the Gulf Stream. So there's some of the water circulation, there's the physics of it, there's the geology, but I also want to go over what the economics are for the Gulf of Mexico. This is something that most people don't realize about it. So 25% of all US domestic and commercial fishing revenue, which also includes these things: the shrimp, king mackerel, amberjacks, hogfish, snapper, spiny lobster, not to be confused with Maine lobster, stony crab, and reef fish, are all harvested in the Gulf of Mexico. And that equals, as of 2020, a total economic impact of $200 million just for these fish. So that's clearly quite a big thing. But also they are known for the recreational, and 40% of all US recreational fin fish, so this is a big fish, that also are including snappers, groupers, and mackerel, are fished in the Gulf of Mexico. So if you add all of this all up, here's the total economic impact for 2020, just to give you guys a big shocking number: $15 billion. Now, you have to remember when we're talking about total economic impact, it's not just you go and catch the fish and the fish costs $15 billion. It doesn't. You have to deal with boat rentals, hotel, food, transportation, hiring of these people. All of these are part of the economic impact of this. Car rentals, they're all part of the economic impact on the Gulf of Mexico. So what other marine life do we have in the Gulf of Mexico? So there's 29 species of marine mammals. These also include manatees and whales. And here's a lovely picture of one of them sitting right on one of the oil rigs. But we also have 7 sea turtle species. That's part of our reptiles. And we also have marine invertebrates. And those are some of the ones that I've studied. Oysters, crabs, shrimp, corals are actually an invertebrate. By the way, if anybody doesn't know, coral's closest relation is actually the jellyfish. They also have the little thing. They're both in the same family of Cinerea. And they do have attitude. People think that corals don't have attitude. Yes, they do. When we're actually having them and we're growing them in the labs, we have to keep them apart because they will try to bash each other. It's what they do. They reach out and zap each other. That's what they have. So we have the 7 turtle species in the Gulf of Mexico, which is another thing that was truly important in the Gulf issue with the Gulf thing. So also we have in the fish, we have sharks, eels, stingrays. We have the commercial and recreational fisheries. We also have birds, natives, which are spoonbills, pelicans, egrets, and ibises. So we have all of these in there. So you can see it is a very, very diverse and huge biodiversity for the environment. And if you did see on the left-hand side, that picture is actually an entire group of stingrays swimming together. Any questions so far? Oh, okay. So other areas of Gulf marine life we deal with the marine plants, seagrasses and mangroves. Seagrasses and mangroves are part of the trifecta of helping to preserve areas for, especially for hurricanes, and for fish. The mangroves and the beaches and the corals are actually the true trifecta. They help stop and slow the storm surges that come in for hurricanes. Seagrasses are great for juvenile fisheries, and that's one of the things that we need for those fish. Mangroves, the ones you're seeing right here, are the red mangrove. That's also known as Rhizophora mangle. That's a scientific name. Red mangroves, there are 3 types that you hear a lot. You hear red mangrove, you hear black mangrove, you hear white mangrove. Sometimes white mangrove is referred to as buttonwood. What's interesting is that none of them are in the same species area. Rhizophora mangle is a totally different one than the black mangrove. Black mangrove is actually more closely related to cypress. They just have different ways. They can all, salt tolerance is the reason they get called a mangrove. So another thing that we have, which is huge, and I did a lot of research on, is the algae and microscopic marine life. Now, this is a huge thing. For something that's so small, it's really important. These diatoms, amoebas, and the algae, the red, the browns, the greens, and what you're looking at right here is some diatoms, little section, and each one of those has a little thing. They're all actually, those diatoms are, the shells of them, the cysts we call them, are made of calcium. And that's why when they die, they sink to the bottom of the ocean and we can find them. These are really important. And to give you an idea of this, that bar at the bottom corner is what's called 50 microns. And to give you an idea how big a micron is, that there are 26,400 microns in an inch. So that just gives you an idea, just that's an inch. So really, really small that we're dealing with. And this is done through electron microscopy. So Louisiana Intercontinental Shelf. This is where I did some of my very first research. So to give you an idea of what you're looking at, this is actually from Louisiana. You can see the Mississippi River is coming down through here, and this is Florida over in the top. So the whole area here, really from Apalachicola all the way up, this is the Mississippi tidal basin. And it is actually one of the largest ecological trouble spots we have in the United States. So the research project I did was a 1990s, a benchmark study we did for this. And what's really interesting about this, it was called the NECOP study, which is a nutrient enhanced coastal ocean productivity program. If you haven't figured out yet, we like to do a lot of abbreviations. So NECOP it is. When I did this, I actually went down and took on the back end of a boat and took samples on this. And we looked at for both the spatial, which is space areas, and temporal time environmental impacts. So we were looking at how things happen over areas and times. And the way that we did this was looking at a little tiny critter called an ostracod. Now, most people go, what the heck's an ostracod? And I don't blame you, because there's probably about 100 of us in the world that actually study them. An ostracod is if you take a shrimp and shove it into a clamshell and make it the size of the head of a pin. And what's great about that is that they have been around for about 560 million years. Nobody argues if I try to collect them, because nobody knows, and they're very, very abundant. They're not endangered in any ways or means. And it allows us, because they've been there and they've had their environmental niche for so many years, millions of years, we know what we see now is what we saw then. So that helps us. So I can help me find what's going on naturally. So what has happened in the natural environment, but also what we call anthropogenically, which means we can look at it and see how humans have impacted the area. That's all that anthropogenic means, just big fancy word for what did we do to the environment as humans. So the NECOP study, productivity, is, here we go. There's the boat I was on. Actually got 2 black eyes doing my research on there, and that was because I was looking on it. It corkscrews when you're on it because it's a flat bottom boat, and I was on them looking at the through a microscope, and we got caught in a big wind, and I got both of them in my eyes. People said I looked like a raccoon. So what we did was we actually took, these are sampling cores, and they look really fancy, but they're not. They're, they were expensive. I will not deny you that. These go down, and we put them down at the bottom of the ocean, and we trigger a weight, and it actually cores the bottom of the ocean. And by doing these cores, we can get full-on samples that we can go back in time. And this is what a core looks like. And the cores we were taking were about a yard, a little about a meter, a little bit less, of sediment, otherwise known as mud, that we took from the bottom. And when you're taking sediment cores, the top is the newest and the oldest goes down. So you go back in time as you were going down these cores. So this core, this is the one we took in 1995, and this core goes all the way down to 1900. So you can see we have almost 100 years worth of sediment. And then what we did was we went through each section and we looked to see what we could find. And we could see there's the ostracod, the Loxacantia, which is the one I was looking for, and the Ophidium forams. It's a forum, Ophidium is the species of it, which are also beautiful, much smaller. And they also tell us what we're dealing with salt or fresh water. If we see Ophidium, we know that it's much more in the freshwater environment. So why the heck were we doing this? Why were we checking out, other than having fun on the back of a boat, putting things over the water, pulling up mud, and looking at it on the microscopes and on the electron microscopes once we got back into the lab? Well, what we did was we looked at the abundance, especially with the Loxacantia. Now, Loxacantia is a really interesting ostracod because when you have what are called hypoxic or dead zones. So when you hear about dead zones happening in the water, which means there's no oxygen, it's an anoxic event, there's no oxygen in there, everything dies. These guys party. These guys go into full reproductive mode. Everything else is dying. It goes, woohoo, let's go party and let's reproduce. So when we go back, we can actually measure what we have for dead zones versus the amount of Loxacantia. So if you look at the bright pink colors, those are the really dead areas. And if you look over here where we've had huge abundances in our sample, you can actually determine what is going on over time, because we weren't really paying attention to these things in the 1900s, but the animals were there. and the animals allowed us to do an environmental impact study. What we found was that the USDA came out with the amount of fertilizer that was coming off of the Mississippi River Delta. And we were actually able to match the increase of the amount of pollution that came off from the fertilizers, especially the nitrates and nitrites, came out, causing these algal blooms, which caused all the oxygen to get sucked out, which caused everything else to die and caused the Loxacantia to go into party mode. So what we were actually able to prove was with these little critters that the amount of fertilizers going into the Mississippi, from the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico, were causing the dead zones. And that actually caused new rules and regulations as to how much fertilizer you can actually put near the Mississippi River. And the reason you have to think about that is that the Mississippi River goes right through the breadbasket of the United States. So home of Wonder Bread, that's what we're causing. So since 1995, when the new legislation was put out after we published our results, we were actually able to see a decrease in the dead zones coming off the Mississippi River because of the reduction of fertilization. So that was nice to have something that was really little tiny to cause something that was a really big event. And it also helped that marine biologists, we are notorious for never throwing anything out. So we still had the cores when the next big thing happened, which was 2010 with the oil spill. We were the only research project that had sediments done close to where the oil spill happened before the oil spill. We were the ones, we had the baseline is what we call it. So that was really kind of cool. They called us up and said, hey, you wouldn't still happen to have those cores? And I went, dusted them off. Of course we do. We never throw anything out. So the oil spill, let's go through some of these statistics on this because it's kind of scary. 205.8 million gallons of crude oil were released during this oil spill. Of that, excuse me, 68,000 square miles of the entire Gulf and the land and wetlands around it were impacted. So the blend of asphalt, excuse me, take a swig here. So this oil is not like the oil that you use to change your car in your oil or your gross or gasoline. It is like tar. It is asphalt like, it is tar balls. So it is really, really thick. And the people that were dealing with the oil spills had three ways of addressing it. Containment, holding it in place, making sure it doesn't go anywhere. Removal of it, scooping it up, seeing where we could pump it out to. And dilution and dispersal. And that's actually the one that causes the most trouble, as a strange thing. So containment, here we go as a sample. We have oil floats when it's in its thing. So it floats up there. So by using containment and by using these booms, they're about 18 to 48 inches above the water and below it. The problem is with containment is it can only be used in slow and calm waters. And for the oil spill, they actually deployed over 300,000 feet of this, and it was used primarily to protect the Mississippi River Delta and some of their coastlines and wetlands around there. But if it has any kind of chop, it won't work because the chop will just push the oil right over the top of the booms. So if you see a lot of oil spills, you'll see these. So removal, they had three basic approaches. You burn it off, which then causes atmospheric pollution, but about 5% of it was burned off. They actually did over 400 controlled burns, and they estimated they burned off 9 to 13 million gallons from this. The second thing they did was skimming. They actually went around with boats and they skimmed it off and put it into pumps. And that was about 3%. It doesn't work very well, especially you need, again, calm areas. They recovered about 17% from the wellhead itself. That's when they closed it off and then they pumped it off into a new ship. So that one was probably the best of the removals. Now, dispersal And now we have the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. If you remember, 1990 was also just after the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska. So we were dealing with that. So trying to figure out how to minimize the impact of oil spills. Now, chemical dispersals have been controversial for decades. So dispersants minimizing this have been an issue. So there's two types. You have naturally dispersed, that's weather, good hurricane, good heavy storm, that'll naturally disperse it right out there. So two types, we have the naturally dispersed, about 16% dispersed that way. Chemically dispersed was about 8%. And they used two types of core exit. So the question is, and we don't know yet, and we're still looking at it 11 years later, is it a bioaccumulator? Does it biodegrade? And while neither are the least toxic, these two types of core exit, they have to go through the EPA for approval of the disbursements. And they're very toxic still. BP used core exit because it was the easiest available on the time of the rig explosion. But it's not that great because oil in the Gulf of Mexico is incredibly natural. Anybody that's ever been in the Gulf of Mexico or gone there, you see tar balls on the beach. The ecosystems of the Gulf are very basically savvy of oil. They know that the ecosystems can handle it. The ecosystems can't handle the chemical dispersant. And one of the research projects that was done, they did one up in Alaska, they did one here for this spill, is they found that if you just let a wetland alone, you did a little bit of natural disbursement, or you just let it clean, or you did some water blasting, did not use any chemicals, those wetlands have already come back. The wetlands that we used these chemical disbursements on have not. In fact, they're still pretty much dead. And even the ones in Alaska 20 years later still haven't really come back. And the reason is it's the chemical, they're killing what's in there. That's one of the reasons that environmentalists are very much, and eco-scientists like myself are very much against the chemical disbursements, because they cause this long-term effect. So why do they use it? Why do they do that? And my belief, and this is just mine, is that it looks really great on camera. It looks really great that they've showed the public relations as to how they are cleaning up the oil. Because if you do that and you just don't let nature take its course, it looks better for the camera. So PR. An estimated 25% of the oil actually evaporated or dissolved. And the other 26% is listed as residual. That means, and just to give you a dispersed, dissolved, and residual does not mean gone. It's still there. It hasn't gone away. It's still around, but it's gone into such micro areas that we just can't find it. It's not sitting in a bubble somewhere. It's not sitting in there. It's just gone into such a micro level, you can't see it. So when we're doing the assessments, and you can see this is one of the pictures of the dunes. You have the tar balls there. We're looking at, for the assessment, we looked at beach habitat, dune habitat, coastal vegetation, which is some of the grasses, the online grass, we have the seagrasses beds, and we also are looking at oiling of offshore sand, and that's what the bottom right-hand corner is. You can see actually where the oil is in the sand basis in the core. And we also looked at the wildlife. So there are a ton of marine protected areas here in the Gulf of Mexico.
The audio's gone away.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, it comes and goes, but it may be me. I just got a notice that my internet's unstable, but go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, ours is staying steady.
Okay, thank you, Dave.
We are all right too.
Okay. So,
Mine also.
All right. So does anybody have any questions while I take a break here for when we're doing this? Any questions so far?
How did you know the core went to 1900? How do you test? Is this
carbon dating?
Okay, I was gonna ask that. Okay.
Yeah, we actually use stable isotope analysis for carbon dating to actually determine what it is, because there are things in there that help, and we can actually tell the carbon on the carapace that we study as well. So we can do that. And we also know approximately, we could guesstimate anyway, because we know how much sediment gets dropped every year. So we were pretty close. So we knew that if we did a meter's depth, what we would get about 100 years, and then the carbon dating confirmed it for us.
Has there been any improvement on letting nature take its course as opposed to using chemicals?
There has been. There's been a lot of arguments going out, but the environmental eco people like myself have managed to finally show the research that quit using all of these particularly potentially hazardous materials. It's been a work, but since BP got nailed with such a large fine, they're actually listening to us now.
Good.
So what you're looking at here is actually, you can see New Orleans is up in the upper corner over here. There's Lake Pontchartrain. And then you have here is to Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and you have Louisiana here. So the deep sea horizon oil spill was down at the bottom of this. Now, every place that you see a red square and a red dot, those are actually marine protected areas within the Gulf of Mexico. These are areas that are very much important to ecosystems for the environment. So they cannot, they're federal, state, they could be tribal, but they are regulated as to who can fish them, who can go in there, what can be done with them. A lot of the times we're dealing with wetlands, so we're dealing with juvenile fisheries, we're also dealing with sea turtles, we're dealing with anything that could be negatively impacting the ecosystem and the environment in the Gulf of Mexico. So we really watched out for those with dealing with the oil spills. A lot of those we could do on boom, but not everything. So we have the effects on the wildlife. So you have a bunch of different ways. You have direct effects for oil spills on wildlife. And this is ingestion is one of them. That's when they eat it and they could swallow the oil particulates, and that can come right in. It can either be that they've gotten it through the water, or they've eaten it through the prey that have already had it in there. So that has been exposed to oil. The second one is absorption. That can be where they come in direct contact with it. It can be on their skin. That's the one that can you see a lot of with birds. The other one that we can deal with is inhalation. So this is when the animals breathe in the volatiles. So think about way back before they had all the captures on your gas station. If you went and pumped gas, you could smell the gasoline. That is actually the vapors that we're talking about, and they inhaled those, and those are not good for you. They're volatile organics. So we have that. And so then we also have the indirect effects of oil spills on the wildlife. We have to move them. We have to relocate their home, where they are. They can't be dealing with at this point. It increases their foraging time. So if they're trying to find something and their food has moved because the oil has had there, that can create a longer period of time. It can create farther issues for them to be able to eat. So that has one of those for the time error, so foraging. And it also disrupts natural life cycles, because it can cause, for sea turtles especially, and we'll go into this in a little bit, sea turtles, the adults can survive an oil spill, but the eggs have basically 100% mortality if they're exposed to oil. So we have, whoop, went too fast on that one. So the other thing we have is the influence is the way and the amount of time that they've been exposed. Also the age, the health, and what reproduction state they are in. So all of these can impact how oil can impact the wildlife. So it is disrupting for the wildlife, no matter what you deal with. They can handle it, but just in the sheer size and mass quantity of this oil spill really just hit the wildlife in that Gulf. Also the type of dispersants. Again, the dispersements can also be carcinogenic and cause other issues with the wildlife. Again, so it's not just the oil, it's the dispersants they used. So current research projects, what are we doing? So BP as if you remember, got slammed with a very, very large fine. And a good portion of it had to go to research. Now, we have actually received money for this, but it isn't directly through the BP. They don't pay us directly. The money went through a group called Go Moses, which is the Gulf of Mexico Environmental Science Program. And that money came to us and was allowed to be able to study the areas that were impacted in the whole Gulf in itself. So there's 3 major research projects that are still ongoing to this day. One is deep sea fish especially. Another is sea turtles, because remember I said they have a really hard problem with eggs and oil. And the other are sharks, because there's still a lot of sharks in the Gulf of Mexico. And these are research projects that we've been doing now for over 11 years. And when you're dealing with research projects, you're usually dealing with that long period of time to see how things are doing for the environment. So deep sea fish, let's just go over that. So here is a graph of what a deep sea abyssal zones and everything that we're looking at. So most people know about life in what we call the intertidal zone and going all the way down to the mesopelagic, otherwise known as the twilight zone. But anything below that is you don't get photosynthesis because there's no light. And so it is the largest portion of all of the ocean together. Now, that doesn't mean there's not life down there. There's actually quite a lot of life, but it's also one of the largest areas of water we're dealing with. And when we're dealing with this, that first of all, just to give you an idea, 79% of the Earth's water is more than 1,000 meters deep. So that's below the visual planing on that. So we have that. And then what we do is we study the research. The largest migration in the world, and it's the largest migration in the world, happens twice a day. Happens here, happens there, and that is all the animals that especially are the predator animals and some of the phytoplanktons that actually photosynthesize but hide in the deep zones every night go up into the visual areas and eat. And then every morning they go back down. Largest migration in the world, and nobody knows about it except us little marine biologists who go, "Ooh, that's cool." So when we're looking at the deep sea fish that we're looking at, they are not what you think about as fish. These are the funkiest fish you've ever seen. I am a firm believer that these fish are what give all the horror movies their aliens in when you're looking at Hollywood. So as I said, actually more than 60% of the Earth is more than 1,600 meters deep, which is half a mile. And those are the mesopelagic, bathypelagic, and abyssopelagic fish. Otherwise known as pelagic means that they're just out free roaming. They're not in any wetland areas. They're not close up. They are out in the big open water. There is no up, down, left, or right for these guys because they have no floor. Everything is 3-dimensional for them. So here's one of the ones. This is one of my favorites. You see his really big eye. So he's in migration. And you see these dots on the bottom of him. Those are actually bioluminescence. And these bioluminescence allow for camouflage. They can match it. So if something is at the bottom looking up, he'll blend into whatever the color is above him on that. So he is one of those little fish that everybody else eats. So that's what those photophores are. They're 50% of the fish are bioluminescent. Here's an interesting fact. Some of the predator animals have actually developed coatings around their stomach. So when they eat one of these prey that is bioluminescent, they themselves do not bioluminesce. They don't glow. So something else bigger than them could eat them. So the photophores are used for camouflage. Some of them, if you've ever watched Finding Nemo with anybody and you see the fish with the angler fish, that little glowing thing, that is again another bioluminescent, that's for prey attractant. And so there are 2 major types of fish when we're dealing with these deep sea fish. The filter feeders that are just going around and finding anything they can by filter feeding out. And then the ambush predators. These are the ones that are just lying in wait and trying to find something. Here's one of our lovely pictures of one of our ambush predators. We actually have found one recently in this lab that they call the sharpshooter. And that's because it has right above its eyes, it has bioluminescent and bioluminescence red. Now, most fish in the deep sea can't see red. This fish has developed a way to do it. So it's actually able to see a fish and the fish can't see it. So that's why that's its ambush predator. And so it has developed this ability to see red. So we just call it the sharpshooter. So morphology of these fish. They are really funky fish. They are not what you're going to see in Publix. They're adapted to cold, dark, high pressure, and not much food. Very, very scarce food. Remember, we're dealing with large quantities of water. Here's another one of my favorites. He can actually pop his retinas out and allow to be focusing in. So one of the things you don't think of, they have very, very weak muscles. If you have a lot of muscle, you spend a lot of your energy just keeping those muscles in going. So by having weak muscles, you have to catch. That's why they're ambush predators. They only spend a little time swimming to catch something. They're not like a marlin, which has these huge muscles. And marlins can actually burn themselves out because of using all of this quick speed. So we have that. And the other thing they have are these ways, these organs, and that can use for sensing. So that's just another one. So if it finds something, this one down at the bottom, if it finds something, catching it, it can swim away quickly at that point. So very low metabolism, again, that goes with the weak muscles. So some of the deep sea fish research that we've done. Direct assessment. We've actually gone down and collected things. And how do we collect them? We actually have a very large net. The net is the size of half a mile long. The mouth of it's the size of a football field. And we put it down and we catch it and we take sections. We close off at different areas as we're going along. So we have this fish is actually one of our hunting fish. We look at the taxonomy. This is one of my favorites. It's a hatchet fish. And just by the way, this guy's about this big. And we look at how much is down there. We look at the genetic diversity of it, as well as we look at the community ecology, what's going on, and depth zone. Again, another one of my favorite fish, because come on, if this is not weird, I don't know what is. So we look at how everything matches. For sharks, we're looking at, these are upper trophic, which means fancy thing is they're the bosses. They eat everything. We are not an apex predator. They are, they'll eat everything. This is actually a deep sea shark that they're looking at right there. But we're also looking as part of the research is migratory. Where do they go? We tag them and we try to figure out where they're going and what they've been. We're also looking at what they're eating, what their various types are out there. There are some of these deep sea one. This is actually a cookie cutter shark, and it actually eats just little bits and pieces off of larger fish. So that's why it's called cookie cutter, because you just try to find what you have. And these guys can be common up to 6,000 feet deep. So we also looked at stomach contact analysis and tissue to see how their diets have changed over time. Did the oil impact their diets or didn't it? And then we're still looking at that. And we're also looking at to see what the population size is. We still have a huge issue with shark finning, even though it's illegal in this country. It is illegal in Mexico, but remember, there is an opening between the Gulf of Mexico and everything else. So sharks come in and out. They migrate all the way through. They don't just stay in the Gulf of Mexico. They wander. So what the current status is of this? We first went out for all of this research. We first went out into 2010. We did genetic analysis for both sponges and looked at that, and also sharks, looked at stable isotope. Stable isotope analysis tells us what the temperature was, what the salinity was, what the history of something is on the isotopic level. These are what stable isotopes. These are not radioactive. These never change. And we also, for the sharks, we did sharking. We transmitted. Some we did internally with the smaller sharks. We did internals. And then we had that go up. Now, the trouble is with shark transmitters, they have to be up at a certain level close to the surface of the water or the satellites don't get it. So we can't do shark tagging like you would think for the deep sea fish. We just sort of have to hope we find them. So sea turtles, even though they're really robust, they can survive being attacked by sharks and everything else. When they're little, 1 in 1,000 will make it to the shoreline after they've hatched. 1 in 10,000 will actually make it to full-on adulthood. So when you're having with oil, they're actually as alive. They're fine. They're adults. They can handle it. There are 5 current species of sea turtles in there. That's loggerhead, Kemp's Ready, leatherback, greens, and hawksbill. And I had to think for that for a minute. They all live in the Gulf of Mexico. And even though they can survive it, they don't particularly care for it. All of these sea turtles are endangered or threatened. So the oil spill actually happened during the entire nesting season in 2010. So what did we do? Because we knew that if the oil got into those, they would die. They would have deformities, they just wouldn't hatch. So what we did, we moved 25,000 eggs to the East Coast. How did we do this? Graduate students. We said, you can do it and we will not pay you, but you can put it on your resume. And that's the way we did it. And so they were actually all put in there, and they were put in was what's called the mother sand. So the nest and the sand that they were in itself was put into the coolers. And out of that 25,000, how did we get them over there, by the way? FedEx. FedEx gave us a truck and we moved them that way. 15,000 of these eggs hatched, and we sampled the DNA on them and we released them in the Atlantic. So one of the things that we've been basically, and we're coming up to questions as to whether this is true or not, is that the turtles always return to where they were hatched. The question is, when do they imprint onto the mother sand? Do they imprint to it when they're in an egg, or do they imprint on it when they're going across the beach? And the question is, we don't know. The current weather oil that we have, by the way, is not impacting any of the next seasons. Our question right now is where will the turtles return? Have they imprinted on the East Coast, or have they imprinted on the West Coast mother sand? We won't know for another 20 years because it takes up to 30 years for these sea turtles to reach sexual maturity, for the females to return back to the nest. And that, at an hour, is all of my statement about the Gulf of Mexico.
How would you even know if that was a transplanted turtle?
We actually did tagging on them. We put little tags on them, as well as we
okay.
did genetic sampling. So yes, we have many ways of doing that. One of the interesting things we've just found out in the past couple of years, because we've now been able to actually satellite tag sea turtles, is that we found, especially with leatherbacks, they may not go back and nest on the same beach they were hatched on. We have one female, she's about 800 pounds. And she went and laid a nest in Jacksonville, which is where she came from. But she's also gone to the Bahamas and laid nests over there. And they're also kind of messy. You got a 10-foot fin span, you can do whatever you want with your nest.
That's amazing that you're able to track them.
Oh yes, it's a lot of fun to track those. We do have they're only females that we can track because they're the only ones that ever come back. And what we do is we wait for a nest to be laid, and once we confirm that the nest is laid, we check the female on her way out, make sure she's okay. We take a blood sample, we do a tag, and then we glue a satellite onto her carapace, a satellite tag on that, because they do have to come up for air, so they bing us all the time and we can see where they're going.
That was my next question, is how do you actually tag them? And I guess whatever that radar is, it's not something that requires like a battery charge, or it just lasts indefinitely, or?
When the battery runs out, the battery runs out. Usually we get 2 to 3 years on a good time. Shark tagging, we're lucky if we can get 18 months.
Wow, wow.
So you wouldn't have a tag when they became sexually mature?
No, we wouldn't have a satellite tag at that. We catch those when they're sexually mature, but we also have little pin tags that look like a safety pin, and we put them on their lower flipper. So if we catch one of those when they come into shore, we can see those, we can mark the number, and we call into we have a local database. We actually have a statewide database and says, hey, where did this number hatch from?
Can
Wow,
you
that's a lot of detail.
Yeah.
are we having success, like with the beach watches where we try to save the eggs? Is that really being successful, or are turtles disappearing?
We're actually really increasing in the number of nests. When I started working on the sea turtle project back in 1992 in Broward County, we considered a really good time if we had 800 nests in Broward County. Last year, we had over 2,500.
Ah,
So
good.
it is increasing and we're having that. Now, one of the big things we think is helping with that is we actually do not move the nests anymore. And that's because we have this wonderful lights out for sea turtles through the entire county. When I started, it was only in Hillsborough and we had to move everything else. We would have to see if it was light pollutant or not. And then we would have to move, and we only had about a 60% survivability rate from the move and the hatching. Now we're up over 75% of the hatching because we're not moving the eggs.
And just one turtle out of the nest tends to make it back to the sea.
Oh, you're lucky if it's that. Probably one turtle out of 10 nests.
Really?
1 in 1,000. There's about 100 eggs in each nest. So 1 in 1,000 will make it to the surf or into the past the surf line without getting eaten by a fish. And 1 in 10,000 of those will actually make it to full adulthood.
Hmm.
We've heard a lot about climate change heating up, and that the hotter the nest, they're females. Is there an issue with having some males survive?
It's actually been really kind of interesting. It's a natural environment. When they lay the eggs are actually gender neutral. It is the temperature in the nest that determines whether where in the nest. So if they're inside the nest, that's the warmer area. So that's the hotter. They tend to be females. The outer areas are cooler. So those tend to be males. And the way you can always remember that is hot chicks, cool dudes. And that's the way we go for that. There has been some issues down in Australia. 2 years ago, their last nesting, 2 years ago nesting season, the beach was so warm they had no males in those nests. We have not run into that here, but they did have that. They had an entire generation 1 year where there were all females in the eggs. But luckily, there's still enough males running out there that we can help with that.
Do you collaborate or share notes with other oceanographic centers, like within the state, within the country, and other parts of the world?
Constantly. That's the one thing that scientists are all well known for, is we share everything. It's not, we have a saying, if it's not published, it doesn't count. So we always share everything on that. We also have at our university, we have something called NSU Works, and it is a repository of all of our publications. So if you want to go and see what our reports are to Broward County about all of our sea turtle nesting projects, they're all available there and they're open to the public.
Wow, that's cool. Would we be able to understand it? Or are they in really scientific terms?
Some of them tend to be a little on the scientific term side, but one of the cool things you can get, they have the very front page is the overview. So it gets into scientific-y stuff afterwards, but the overview, and you can always see the graph, which is a lovely little, okay, we've done this. And I actually did a mentorship project with an undergraduate and 2 high school students last year, where we actually looked at sea turtle nests and if having hurricanes impacted the way they nest, if they went farther up the shore or not. And we found that they really didn't. And we did 30 years worth of data. So we found that, and so, yeah, I had a bunch of high school students doing statistics. Made them work.
Can't think of a better way to learn.
Yeah. Get to go there, and I took them down and introduced them to captains. So, and I had a couple of people that actually do I don't go out and do the collections anymore. I leave that to the younger ones. I did it enough in my past. So I actually had the students interview a couple of our current people that do the research and go out and do the collection, so they could get a grasp of what the data was and what they were collecting. Not just being numbers, that these numbers equal a set of turtles.
Alyssa,
Mm-hmm.
I'm writing a book. Like one of the short chapters is dealing with sea turtles.
Okay.
When we're all through here, if you're willing, I'd like to get your address and send you that chapter, and you tear it apart if it's not accurate. I've done research, but you know, I trust what you had to say in case I'm saying something wrong.
Certainly, David. It's Missy.
So I'll hang on when we're done and get your address or somehow.
Yeah, Elle can give it to you. She's got all my contact information.
Oh, okay. All right. I'll get it from you, yeah.
I'll get it to you, David.
And Twyla has my contact information anyway through Nova Singers.
Mhm.
Any other questions? I hope that you enjoyed it, maybe learned
Yeah,
something from it.
thank you.
That's
It was
fascinating.
Learned a
very
lot.
interesting. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're
Yeah.
welcome.
Yeah,
You're
it
a
was
very good
fascinating.
speaker.
Yeah, fascinating.
Thank you for the presentation, and just also thank you so much for all the work that you do. I mean, we take it for granted. We're not really paying attention to this in our day to day, but it's unbelievable work that you're doing. It really is.
Yeah.
It's fun. It's fun. I have my colleagues that are over in the humanities side are like, well, why are you running around in sneakers? I'm like, well, I'm not going to go in the mud in nice dress shoes. Thank you very much. So we have that. And I'm hoping that one of these days when we can open back up, I can actually come back up, because this was supposed to be in person, but we'll hopefully soon be able to come up and be in person again. And you can see all my little quirks that I do when I'm talking, instead of
We'll
just my
definitely
head.
have you back. And we also, I would love to come back on a field trip down to the center and see you as well.
Yes, I'm hoping, let's hope, see if numbers increase, improve, and they'll open us back up, because right now we're only allowing in NSU people for everything. And the MEC has not opened up again yet. It's still closed to the public. But we still have Captain, our resident sea turtle. She's still a diva. She's just missing everybody. 70 pounds of look at me.
What's the difference? I'm sorry, this is a naive question, but what's the difference between what the MEC Center does and what you guys do over at the Oceanographic Center?
MEC is our people-facing arm of it. It's a collaboration between NSU and Broward County. It's actually part of the Broward County Park System. And we do environmental awareness, environmental education, and helping to learn, teach people what it is to help, what a TED, a turtle exclusion device is, see what the turtles are, how you can help, how you can be various things. So that's the educational arm. And the Oceanographic campus is actually mostly, it's the research and teaching arm. We have undergraduates, graduates, as well as our research projects are held there.
Amazing. I'm so grateful to you for taking the time, especially during this time of year, because I know how busy you are. I fully appreciate that. And I'm thrilled, and I'm so grateful that you were able to do this for us today.
Oh, sure thing.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody have any last parting thoughts or questions for Missy?
Thank you a
so
lot.
much. Thank you. We will be in touch. We'll keep in touch. As soon as I can have you here, I would love to do that.
Okay.
Okay.
Great,
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.